We are here today with Jason Helland, the Republican nominee for Secretary of State. We appreciate you being here today and invite you to make an opening statement as to why you're the best candidate for this office.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me here today. I'm Jason Helland. I'm the Grundy County State's Attorney. I've been the Grundy County State's Attorney since 2012. And this particular election for Secretary of State is a term limits election. 80% of Illinoisans favor term limits, and the Secretary of State, Jesse White, has served a record-breaking 5 terms for Secretary of State. He's also stated over the last 10 years that he wanted to retire. And he simply won't retire because he controls Mike Madigan's jobs. He's Mike Madigan's chief patronage officer. This office is suffering from waste, fraud, and abuse, and I look forward to discussing those issues over the next half hour here. As I stated, I'm a career prosecutor. I've been an attorney for approximately 15 years. I'm not a political insider. I'm married with a 5-year-old, and I live in Mazan, Illinois.
Okay, very good. You started talking about this a little bit, but you are the state's attorney for Grundy County. So, and share with us how both your professional work and your public service would be an asset if you were the Secretary of State.
Obviously, you can't have a political novice take over a Secretary of State's office that has more than 3,500 jobs. Just backing up briefly, I went to Joliet Junior College. I got my law enforcement degree there in 1996. That's relevant to this race because the Secretary of State's office has a police force. I transferred to the University of St. Francis. I graduated there in 1999 with a political science degree. Then I ultimately graduated the John Marshall Law School in 2003. Once I got out of the John Marshall Law School, I knew that I wanted to be a prosecutor, and I worked in Kankakee County at the State's Attorney's Office for 8.5 years, and I was the first Republican-elected State's Attorney in Grundy County in 28 years when I won in 2012 and again in 2016. So my political experience is a great asset here just because this is a very difficult job. Politics is not easy.
So, speaking of politics, how is it that you came to be a Republican? And then what are a couple of principles that you think that Republicans generally hold, and how would those play out when you become the Secretary of State?
I mean, the number one issue is that I've been a Republican for as long as I can remember, and it's because I align myself with a lot of the platform issues of the Republican Party. Fiscal conservative is number one, and I think at a time when the state is completely broke, our bond status is just above junk bond status, is that we got to conduct this office in a fiscally responsible manner, which the Secretary of State, Jesse White, has failed to do. And I'd take a look at this, is that one of the number one issues in this particular race is trimming the budget. Secretary of State White has proven over and over again that there's too much fat on the budget, and the examples are by looking at the budget numbers in the last few years. In 2014, the Secretary of State's office had expenditures that were $480 million. In 2015, the budget was $529 million, and once the budget impasse hit, it was under $450 million again. So I think there's a lot of wasteful expenditures in that budget. One example in the 2018 or 2019 budget is that there's a national organization of black elected legislators that are getting a $50,000 grant from the Secretary of State's office to go to a legislative conference. And when you take a look at this budget, you go line by line, there's a lot of room for improvement for cutting the budget. One thing that was very controversial during the budget impasse was that Secretary of State White controls Madigan's money. And they had a cartoon here, and it says, "For me, you shouldn't have," and it's Jesse White holding the bag of money for Mike Madigan. And what that was regarding was, in 2015, that Jesse White took $35 million out of his budget and he built schools. And as state's attorney, why is my background an asset to this office is that you only have the duties given to you by the Constitution and state statute. It's not the duties of the constitutional office holders, such as Secretary of State White, to engage in capital improvement projects, building schools in prominent Democratic districts. Where he built the schools were Barbara Flynn Curry's district and Mike Madigan's district. The other 116 legislative districts in the state of Illinois that are underserved, and people are tired of the games.
Do you have any follow-up?
So what I just picked up was that your conservative fiscal policies would push against budget.
Yes, I think that's the number one issue with the Secretary of State's office is that the budget.
So
is
how
too
does that
fat.
make you a Republican, though? How'd you come to be a Republican?
I just align myself with all the party
Was your mom
views.
a Republican?
My parents weren't really into the politics, as are most people aren't into politics. I learned running, this is my third campaign, that most people don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Presbyterian, Independent. They don't care. They ultimately vote with their pocketbook. I would say that an individual like me, I worked at the Eagle Country Market grocery store for 8 years, from 1992 to 2000, when I was going through high school and college. I was making $4.35 an hour, and I was in a union. I was in the United Food Commercial Workers Union, and I'm the working middle class. But when you look at the platform issues such as immigration, strengthening borders, things of that nature, it's issues that I'm concerned about and I'm more for.
Okay.
As you've already mentioned, the incumbent Secretary of State, Jesse White, has been in office since 1999. How would you rate the job he's done overall?
D-.
For the entire term, his entire term in office?
D- for the entire term, and all you have to do is take a look at the audit findings. The audit findings, as far as Secretary of State White, have been absolutely brutal. Did you know in 2016 and 2017 that more than 8 million credit card transactions were processed by the Secretary of State's office? In audit finding 2017-004, and this is available on the Auditor General's website, the vendor that processed the credit card transactions was not compliant with industry standards in protecting personal confidential information, and your personal confidential information was subject to being breached during those years because they were not PCI compliant, which was industry standards for protecting credit card information. There's been one scandal after another, and I'll give you a few examples here. One scandal was Candace Wanzu was hired by the Secretary of State's office, and she was convicted of stealing $230,000 from the Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. She was convicted of stealing nearly $250,000. And what happened after she became on board with the Secretary of State's office? She stole from the Secretary of State. She's put on paid administrative leave for 14 months. And was given a $21,000 payout to leave that office. Human resources is a major issue, and I'll point out Marlene Liss. And Marlene Liss, no degree, no address, 9 names, and 1 great state job, and on a resume, she used a UPS storefront for her home address, and she was eventually put in as the number 2 official regarding the securities division. When you take a look at the Secretary of State's office, I believe that Jesse White will not retire because we've seen what had happened with Rod Blagojevich. We've seen what happened with George Ryan. There's corruption in the office, and they weren't indicted until after they left that office. And here's another example. The government-wide adjustments were materially misstated by approximately $340 million. How can you have a budget that's appropriate if you're misstating your debts and assets by $340 million? That's in the audit finding because they failed to report, I believe, to the General Assembly that they had a ton of pension debt there. They also had recurring findings time after time after time that people were given state vehicles with no documentation that it was for a government-related purpose. And they also had allegations of ghost payrolling between 2005 and 2009, and it basically stated right in the Auditor General's finding that workers were presumed to be working unless otherwise stated. That, in my opinion, is ghost payrolling. Recently, the issues that have been gripping Springfield that we've seen, leaders lead and followers follow. And what has happened in the last 6 months is that we've seen sexual harassment allegations by Tim Mapes, Madigan's chief of staff. He resigned. We also seen allegations made against Lou Lang. He eventually stepped down from a position of leadership in the House. And I think the silence is deafening out of Secretary of State Jesse White when you have 25 departments, over 3,500 employees, and he stated absolutely nothing about sexual harassment over the last 6 months. And when you take a look at Representative Kelly Cassidy, there are employees in the Secretary of State's office that are afraid to come forward because they fear retaliation and they fear losing their job. And what had happened with Representative Kelly Cassidy is that she complained about Madigan's policies as far as handling the sexual harassment complaints, and she believed that an independent commission should be formed to address those issues. And she's retaliated against. She lost a part-time job at the Cook County Sheriff's Department as a result, and that's why people won't come forward. So I believe that leaders lead and followers follow.
What would you like him to come out and say? Just make a statement? I mean, what are policy changes in the office? I guess share what if you had been Secretary of State, you would have done as this started unraveling here in the State House.
If that started unraveling, and Madigan's chief of staff, who White works very close with, is committing acts of sexual harassment, I would take a public stance that we will not tolerate this in our office, and we have clear, defined boundaries of what was going on, and to make sure that the employees were adequately trained and it was adequately addressed, that people would know that it's going to happen. We were at the Sun-Times editorial board last week. He basically said, not my issue, talk to our Inspector General, Jim Burns. That was his point. And that's not a satisfactory answer. As far as he has done some things right. You know, I give somebody a D-. He's done some things right. What we've seen is the organ tissue donation program. That's a good program. That's not a partisan issue. We got more than 6 million people on the organ tissue donation list. We got 5,000 people waiting a organ tissue transplant, and unfortunately 300 people a year die awaiting a transplant. But in the last year, they expanded the organ tissue donation to include the 16 and 17-year-olds with the consent of a parent or guardian. And at this point, there's over 11,500 16 and 17-year-olds that are signed up for that program. That was a winning program. As a prosecutor, I'm all about traffic safety. Some of the traffic safety programs were good when they were implemented, but they need to be better. And one example was, you said that he's been Secretary of State since 1999. And I'm going to go over 3 things. I want to go over the graduated driver's license. I want to go over the BAID program, and I want to go over the recreational marijuana, which I think is going to be legalized here in the next 2 years. The graduated driver's license program was a mixed bag, and here's why. In 1999, when Secretary of State White took over, the #1 cause of death of our teens was traffic fatalities. The graduated driver's license program wasn't implemented until 2008. It took him 9 years in his 3rd term to act on the graduated driver's license permits, which at that time, the 16-year-old got a driver's license without restrictions. It required more restrictions to drive. We've seen the traffic fatalities go down. And why it could be better is that they've taken a look at the studies, and a lot of the boards have talked to me about distracted driving. Our society in 2008, when that program was implemented, was different than it is now. Is that our teens are addicted to technology, they're addicted to electronics, and we have to take a look at. And this is, I'm not saying it's going to be done, it's got to get looked at. We have to look at the national studies. The national studies show that you can reduce traffic fatalities of our teens by 42%. If you increase the age of driving to 18, if you decrease the nighttime driving, you decrease the number of passengers that are in the vehicle, and take proactive steps. And I think that he took a reactive step there, not a proactive step. When the teens were dying based on traffic crashes and it takes you 9 years to act, that's not acceptable.
I want to just clarify. Did he have authorization to act in those 9 years? Did he need additional permission from the Capitol? I guess I want to be clear when you're talking about this 9 years, what you're referring to.
It's interesting that you say that, because I want to make it very clear. Jesse White can get through the legislature anything he wants. He's got a traffic safety task force. He kills bills. He introduces bills. They have legislators that implement all these programs. And you got to be a strong leader and tell people that these programs are going to be implemented. And I'm going to talk about the BAID program. And I've been a prosecutor, like I said, almost 15 years. I'm the victim of DUI crash. I got hit by a 3-time drunk driver who had a blood alcohol content of .40 2 hours after the crash, with my wife and kid in the vehicle and marijuana in his system. Needless to say, he ended up going to prison. But the BAID program was implemented, and basically the Mothers Against Drunk Driving wanted this program for years. I mean, every state has it at this point, but that's the breath alcohol interlock ignition device. And what that does is that if I got a DUI and I'm given a restricted driving permit from the Secretary of State, that I cannot start that vehicle unless my blood alcohol content is under .025. 20 years ago when that program was implemented, it was a good program. But Secretary of State White has failed to adapt to the current drug trends. There was one state that I read, more than 50% of the DUIs last year were non-alcohol related. And I talked to defense attorneys, and here's the problem with the program, and here's what change needs to be made, and here's exactly how they need to do it, is that if you get a DUI case based on drugs, and we have the opioid epidemic, we have people abusing antidepressant, anti-anxiety medicine. If it says unfit to operate heavy machinery while using this, we got people abusing prescription drugs on the streets. We are seeing polysubstance abuse like I've never seen in the 15 years of my career, is that the DUIs are shifting from alcohol to drugs. But here's the problem, is that if you're a first-time DUI offender, you haven't had a DUI in the last 5 years, you're eligible for the BAID, regardless of whether it's alcohol or drugs. And what used to happen was you'd get a judicial driving permit that you can only drive in a limited scope, to and from work, to and from treatment, to and from education. The BAID program, under Secretary of State White, they can drive 24/7 anywhere as long as they got the device in the car, and the advocates wanted that. The problem is, if I'm on heroin, ecstasy, recreational drugs, prescription drugs, and I got that DUI because that's the drugs I use, I'm eligible for the BAID program, which only detects alcohol. I can be using drugs and legally drive that vehicle 24/7. And here's a problem with it too, is that if you have a medical marijuana card, which I believe that medical marijuana does indeed have a legitimate purpose in the state of Illinois. But if you have a medical marijuana card, you're not eligible for BAID. If I get a DUI based on marijuana in my system, you can get the BAID. There's a fatal flaw. So the remedy is that if you have a non-alcohol related DUI, you shouldn't be able to drive 24/7. You should be required to have a judicial driving permit that allows you to go to and from work, to and from school, and a limited scope, not everywhere. And that's a major failure. Recreational marijuana is a major issue on traffic safety. We're at the Chicago Tribune editorial board 2 weeks ago. And mind you, what's Secretary of State White running for a 6th term for? Did he not accomplish everything he wanted to in the first 5 terms? But I asked him, I said, you're for recreational marijuana because J.B. Pritzker is for it, right? And he said, I've had a couple conversations about it. I haven't had time to formulate an opinion. That's what he said 2 weeks ago.
Well, why are you then opposed to the legalization of recreational marijuana?
Well, I'm getting there.
Okay.
So 2 weeks ago, he said he didn't have an opinion. Last week, he said he did have an opinion. He's against it. And the recreational marijuana is a disaster for traffic safety. That's what some people don't understand with the Secretary of State's office. Rules of the road, traffic safety is key. And what they saw was with the Rocky Mountain HIDA report, and that's the high intensity drug trafficking area, they've put out an annual report. They studied Colorado before there was any medical program. They studied Colorado when they had medical marijuana. And they studied the impact of recreational marijuana in Colorado. And what they seen first year was a 66% increase in traffic-related fatalities due to marijuana, due to the recreational marijuana program. So I believe, am I a legislator? Can I affect policy change and actually draft it? No. The Secretary of State needs to talk to the legislators and tell them that the recreational marijuana program is going to be a major problem. And the proposed law that I saw, and I believe it's going to be the law within the next 2 years, is that the law enforcement isn't adequately trained. We have less than 100 drug recognition experts in the state of Illinois out of 102 counties. And it is just a major problem. Law enforcement isn't adequately prepared for the wave of marijuana-related DUIs that we're going to have. And it's just a bad deal. The proposed legislation talked about this is going to be a $500 to $700 million increase in revenue for the state of Illinois. It's actually going to have a net impact based on the wave of problems that we're going to have. When you're in a small county like Grundy County, I guess I'm the downstate candidate for Secretary of State because I live 10 miles south of I-80, I've been told. That's downstate. But the problems are just are numerous. We don't have, in 102 counties, a lot of the smaller counties don't have adequate substance abuse and mental health treatment facilities, which is the problem, is that if they're going to implement recreational marijuana, I get it. People do drugs all the time. But we need to have the ability to adequately treat the substance abuse and mental health problems that are going to flow from that. And the proposed legislation has just been to pay off pension debt and put it into the general fund. Major problem.
I want to go back to something you said. What has Jesse White not accomplished in his first 5 terms? In your introduction, you said that this is a term limits election. What type of term limits do you think should be in place for this office?
What I think should be in place for any executive constitutional office, and it's because our 4-year terms, is a 2-year cap. Is that
2-term cap or
2-term cap? Is that you shall not exceed 8 years as a constitutional office holder. And I think the reason why, and this is different from my opinion on the local races, like a county board or any county official, when you're talking about a state official, you're talking about a budget north of $500 million, money just corrupts people. And having control of that amount of money, I think that the executive offices should be 2 4-year terms and done. And ultimately, the reason I have a difference between state versus local is because a lot of the times you can't find qualified people to run at a local level. And that's what you see. The legislature, I believe that the good thing with the Senate and the House of Representatives would be 10 years. And the reason it's 10 years is because the House is 2-year terms, and actually the Senate is broke up over 10 years. That it's 3 terms over 10 years. It's 4, 4, and 2, or 4, 2, and 4. So I think with the General Assembly, that 10 years is a good clean break.
You said that money corrupts people. Do you think Jesse White is corrupt?
Absolutely, I think he's corrupt. That's why he's continuing to hold this job. Did you know that his daughter, who works for him, her salary has tripled since she's been there? I mean, that's why he's not leaving, because he's taking care of all his friends. Ultimately, the number one complaint I've heard on the street statewide over the last year is that the Secretary of State has failed to embrace technology. And the reason they failed to embrace technology is because if they embrace technology, that's the reduction of the workforce. Have you recently seen what they've done in places in the private sector like Walmart? We just had Morris. We had a $4 million renovation of Walmart. They have 10 live cash registers, and the rest are self-checkout lines. And I take a look at when you go into the Secretary of State's office, and yet this has to be studied. Obviously, anytime you're doing something, you have to put it out for competitive bid, study it, see what other states have done, and implement it. But I think you should be able to walk into the Secretary of State's office, go through a kiosk, and maybe be able to reduce some human interaction there. But a lot of the problems are, and here's an example, I got a driving abstract here. And we had an individual that was pulled over for driving while revoked. Their driving record showed that they're revoked for DUI in the state of Illinois. And it says right at the bottom, exception, call or mail Secretary of State. And what we found out was we couldn't indict that person because we needed the actual Secretary of State records in hand that weren't available online. We had to put a stamp in the mail. They sent us this letter saying, well, he's revoked for DUI, but he had a driving permit that allowed him to drive as long as he had the BAID device in the car. He didn't have it, so it was a 2-week delay in charging. And I'll give you one example that some defense attorneys talked about. And here's a good example. If I get a DUI, my license is suspended in 46 days, and that's called a statutory summary suspension. You have a right to have a hearing to contest whether an officer had probable cause to make an arrest, because you're going to get your license suspended, which is going to have impact. And I had a defense attorney tell me that they had a summary suspension hearing, and a judge ruled that the officer did not have probable cause to make an arrest for DUI. As a result, the court ordered for that summary suspension to be lifted off the driving record. That individual relied on the court system. You know what the court system does? They communicate everything with the Secretary of State through snail mail. There's a couple options. They could have driven to Springfield from that jurisdiction and had the suspension removed over the counter that day. They could pay which many attorneys use in the state of Illinois, is they forward the court order to a third-party courier in Springfield who then walks it directly across the street and gets the suspension lifted the next day. Or what this person had done is that they allowed the circuit clerk to put a stamp on it, have it sit on a desk for weeks at the Secretary of State because there's no electronic communication. What had happened was the judge ruled that there's no probable cause for the DUI arrest. The suspension should have been removed. Ultimately, that individual, before they removed the suspension through the mail, got arrested for driving while suspended during that summary suspension after the court already ruled the arrest was unlawful, and a prosecutor wanted to forfeit a vehicle. And that's when you really get in a lot of discretion as a prosecutor, is fairness. And there's too many instances that I've been given that this is a disaster because of the failure to automate. I mean, I have attorneys telling me when they're dealing with corporations, there's 376,000 businesses in the state of Illinois, and all the attorneys are telling me not enough documents are online. I want it online, but I'm old school. I think online's good, but the human interaction also has its purpose. So I think ultimately we need to take a look at technology a lot more than we're looking at.
I'd like to stay on that, how you would run the office if you were elected, and specifically the technology. On your campaign website, you mentioned using email more, text and apps more to streamline services and reduce costs. You just mentioned the kiosks. I guess share with us, if you were running this office, how you would modernize this.
I mean, just as you said, it's got to be more technology. We have to reach out to the vendors to figure that out. I mean, Jesse White's never talked about cutting budget consolidation. Here's an example. This is the best example I could give you. And this is, millions of Illinoisans were affected by this. In 2015, in October of that year, Jesse White failed to send out renewal notices for approximately 10 months. And his failure to send out the renewal notices, he ended up collecting $13 million in late fees at $20 a crack on the plates. And they essentially found out that during the course of that, there's only about 25% of the users that were renewing their plates were actually using online technology. I mean, that's just a complete disaster. And if you're not sending out the bill to renew your plates, and then you're tacking on the late fee because somebody didn't pay the bill that they didn't receive, that was unfair. I would have waived all those late fees because during the budget impasse, When that hit, they didn't have the money to put everything in the mail. And I think that's an example right there of a failure, is more and more stuff has to go online. We have to do studies.
Quick, for that one, though, I'll play devil's advocate with you. There is a reminder. It's on your license plate. There is a sticker on your license plate that says that. Where is the personal responsibility of a motorist? I mean, it's not, you don't have a right to drive. It's a privilege to drive. Where is the responsibility of the motorist to say, oh, hey, my license plates are renewed? I know it's more automated now, but when I bought my first car, I was responsible for sending in my payment every month. No one sent me a reminder.
Has anybody ever paid a bill that they never received if every year it was coming through the mail? And the answer is no. I was one of the people that didn't get dinged on the late fee. Why didn't I get dinged on the late fee? Because I'm in law enforcement. And what's the best reason to pull somebody over? Brake light out, tail light out, license plate light burnout, license plate sticker 3-413F. The cops love that ticket. They love, because ultimately traffic stops aren't for your expired sticker. It's for walking up to the vehicle, finding an impaired driver, and drug paraphernalia and drugs open for everybody to see. And like I said, nobody pays bills that they don't receive. I actually did it because I was a responsible motorist. I saw that my plate sticker was going to expire, and I had to go into my glove box and ultimately get the passcode and information, the PIN, from the last time I renewed, and I did it. But $13 million in late fees, that is a great example.
Okay. We talked about that. We've heard you talk a lot about the poor fiscal state of the state, both here and other appearances, how there's a need for a balanced budget. You're going to get no disagreement from this board on that. The budget, though, is decided by the General Assembly and the governor ultimately. So what role would you envision playing if you were elected Secretary of State, helping the state of Illinois accomplish a balanced budget?
Well, you have to look at each individual constitutional office holders. Jesse White has abused the taxpayer at a time that the state does not have the money to pay their bills. We're just above junk bond status. You got to look at ways to cut the budget. The first thing that I did when I was state's attorney is that in 2013, that fiscal year, my first full year as state's attorney, that I had an $800,000 budget. I trimmed that budget by $65,000 the very first year. Yeah, $65,000 doesn't sound that much when you have an $800,000 budget, but I look at every single expenditure in that budget and I say, just because we bought this in the past, do we really need it? And trust me, if I was sitting down negotiating state contracts with individuals, and the vendors love state contracts. You know why they love the state contracts? Because the Illinois Prompt Payment Act. Under Illinois state law, I believe it's after 90 days, if your bills aren't paid by the state, you get 12% interest. Vendors love that. Vendors want to do business with government bodies. And that's what I've learned, is that when I'm sitting down negotiating contracts with vendors, that I'm ultimately in a great position because the vendors know they're going to get paid. And I think with this office, and I'm not just saying this, you can figure it out on your own, is that this Secretary of State doesn't know his budget numbers, he doesn't know his personnel, he doesn't know about the convicted felons, he doesn't know about traffic safety policy. Everything that I've just stated today, he didn't know anything about. He didn't know that he had an audit finding that credit card data under audit finding 2017-4, that credit card data was subject to getting stolen and sold on the dark web. And it said your information could have been stolen. And ultimately, here's what the criminals do. When you steal credit card data and personal identifiers, the criminals sell it on the dark web. You'll see a $5 transaction go through. Once that $5 transaction goes through, you'll see a $5,000 transaction. So when these numbers were possibly compromised at the Secretary of State's office in this audit finding, that was a finding that dated back to 2013, you don't even know if your numbers were compromised from them or some other source. And I think the most despicable thing that happened there is that I told Jesse White 2 weeks ago about that audit finding. He said it didn't exist. And I said, not only did it exist, Your office accepted the findings and blamed the state treasurer for entering the contract with the vendor. So he is not actively engaged in this office. And the reason I think my skill set is the most best fit for this office compared to him, he's a ceremonial office holder. I know the law, and I interpret the Constitution, state statutes, ordinances, and regulations on a daily basis.
One of the other areas, the Secretary of State, they do a lot of record keeping. How would you ensure those documents are stored safely if you were Secretary of State?
It's not real an issue that I've concerned myself with. We've had issues at the county level is that you have to absolutely protect ancient documents and records. I think there's a Local Records Commission Act that requires the storage of records, and that's something that we'd have to take a look at, is that at our county level, they don't have an adequate facility without a leaky roof to protect these documents. I mean, you have to protect documents.
Okay. There's also, well, a number of those records are private, a number of those are also due to the public. So how would you make sure public has access to the records they're entitled to?
Public access to records is very important because you are legally entitled by statute to those records. The Freedom of Information Act has a lot of teeth. And I'll tell you what, is that I've had basically media talk to me about FOIA stuff, and they basically have told me that I'm one of the most responsive state attorneys in the state of Illinois on releasing information that they're asking for. And with the Freedom of Information Act, my job as state attorney is to protect the fiscal integrity of our county. And the FOIA Act, which allows you to have basically public records are presumed to be open for public inspection with limited exceptions, and then they list the exceptions. So they're presumed that I have to turn things over, just take identifiers out of like social security numbers and birthdays and things like that. But here's why the FOIA law got a lot of attention and got my attention a couple years ago, is if we don't respond to a FOIA request within 5 days, you are presumed to have rejected that request. If we reject that request, you have a couple of options. You can go to the public access counselor at the Attorney General's office. What people found out there is that they're overworked, they're underpaid, and they don't get their documents in a timely manner. So option 2, which has more teeth, that I believe was passed about 2 years ago because too many people are blowing off FOIA requests, is that if you file a lawsuit because your FOIA request was denied, the prevailing party is entitled to attorney's fees. You know how many times Grundy County's got sued for failure to comply with FOIA? 0. Because I am very responsive to the information, and we release all the information that we're legally entitled to, and it's not unusual for me to consult another attorney or an attorney at the Attorney General's office and ask them what the scenario is and ask if they'd order me to release them or not, because that's all that one attorney does is Open Meetings Act violations and FOIA. So I take public openness of records. I believe it is your duty to turn things over, because every decision you make, from the budget to personnel, the public has the right to know how their money's being spent, and you are accountable to the taxpayers for your expenditures.
Would you make it easier to get that, put more online? Would I have to, if I went somewhere, would I just be able to get it, or could I just maybe go online and find a nice database on your website for what I'm looking for? What do you envision as Secretary of State doing? Obviously,
that's something that would have to be studied. We'd have to look at what's online now, what could be online, and what we've ultimately seen at, and I've talked this, like I said, out of 90,000 attorneys in the state of Illinois, there's only 102 state attorneys. We're a very specialized breed here, but what the local taxing bodies found out was if they put all the stuff online, it eliminates the requests, and it eliminates the burden on their human resources, because they're not digging up budget numbers from 5 years ago with claims and expenditures that were made. They didn't have to ask because it was all put out there. So let's take a look at where we're at, what we can do better, how much it would cost, and ultimately I think that putting more information online would reduce human resources wasted at the office that could be spent doing other tasks.
a lot of the changes you might want in that office would require legislation. Let's assume Democrats would continue to control the General Assembly if you were elected. How would you as a Republican work with them to accomplish getting things done to benefit the office?
Well, I think things are going to get done very well because I'm not going to build Mike Madigan's schools for $35 million. And I'm talking about cutting the budget 10% the first year. I think the goal will be accomplished when I'm not Jesse White.
But I mean, you're going to, if you wanted legislation to move through that you wanted to champion, you would need, allies in the, or coalition built in the State House. How would you go about doing that if you're in the minority party?
The coalition building, a lot of these issues that I've talked about are not partisan issues. I mean, the thing that I've talked to the legislators is that the media focuses on the 10%, the partisan issues. 90% of the issues are simply worked out. I've worked in a nonpartisan manner as Grundy County State's Attorney. Crime victims don't care if I'm a Republican, Democrat, or Independent. I've worked in a nonpartisan manner. I've worked in a nonpartisan manner with department heads and county board people. So the thing about it is, I don't care what somebody's party affiliation is. The ideas that I've talked about, traffic safety, affects everyone. And I think when you talk to the General Assembly, and I'm armed with facts, studies, data, not feelings, thoughts, and emotions. And if I pull a legislator, and I don't care who it is, I don't care who the governor is, if I ask the legislator, do you want to get hit by a drunk driver driving home tonight? Their answer is going to be no. And I got a program that'll help further that interest, that you're not going to be a victim of a DUI like I was. So I think it's a lot of bedside manner.
Okay. Going back to your running, you're saying this term limits race. You did that. You have mentioned Jesse White's age a couple times. You told the Tribune editorial
Absolutely.
board White is not capable of continuing to serve until his term. This term would end in early 2023.
I agree.
Is it simply his age that makes him unable to do it? I guess I want to know when you bring up his age, why are you bringing that up as opposed to saying he's been in office 5 years?
All you have to do is talk to anybody in Springfield. His health is not good. It's the bottom line. This man, and this is where I did not get a fair shake with the Chicago media. I didn't say elect me because I'm young and he's old.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, you've heard that I have substance. I've done my research, and I am very passionate about why I'm here. Nobody asked me to be here. I want to be here to make Illinois a safer place. And when you're 84 years old, and this isn't about age, this is his own words. As a prosecutor, the best evidence of somebody's intent is their own language. In 2009, Jesse White said, 2010 is going to be my last election. I'm done. Put it in the bank. Before 2014, he said, I'm not going to run again. He ran again. In 2015, he stated to the Chicago media, put it in the bank. I'm done. I want to spend more time with my tumbling team. And then now here we are in 2018. So a couple issues here, and I want to talk about this. This isn't some issue that I brought up. This is issues that the legislators are concerned about his longevity, is that he doesn't have the health to last until 2023 and do that job effectively because he's not effectively doing the job now. He's just a ceremonial office holder. But let's talk about the history of Illinois politics, or U.S. politics. In the 1984 election, what did they say about Ronald Reagan? He's too old. I think Donald Trump was one of the oldest elected presidents. He was like 70 years old at the inauguration because it's about the ability to do the job, the stamina, the energy. So Ronald Reagan in 84, he was in his early 70s, it was an issue. Bob Dole in 96, early 70s, it was an issue. Barack Obama was seen as a genius, according to some media outlets, that when he ran against John McCain in 2008, and John McCain was 71, he was seen as a genius that he talked about John McCain was too old at age 71. It's not about age, it's about his words, and his words have said, I want to be done. And he's wanted to be done since 2009, and that tells you everything that you need to know. Why is he not done? Because he controls Madigan's jobs, and he employs prominent people, and they took a look at this, and here's an example. How do we know there is a chink in the armor? is Mike Hastings filed to run as a Democrat for this office. He filed on the last day. He filed more than 10,000 signatures to run for Secretary of State. Ultimately, he withdrew his candidacy after he's told by Mike Madigan to step down. He withdrew his candidacy the day before the ballots were going to be certified. And obviously, Senator Hastings out of the Orland Park area, he could see what was going on. He knew what the rumors were. He was done, and who is Jesse trying to get in there? And I think one of the things that we talked about at the Chicago Tribune editorial board is that just the endorsements that Jesse White, like I should have backed up. The Democrats did want 2 open seats. They didn't want an open seat for Attorney General, and they didn't want an open seat for Secretary of State. So ultimately, I think there was a discussion that since Lisa wasn't going to run for Attorney General again, we don't want to spend millions of dollars to get our candidates through the primary, so Jesse, just hold the seat. I believe, without reservation, that he will not serve until January 23. I believe that he will resign if he wins this election, which he shouldn't, but if he does, he will resign and they'll appoint somebody. And this election isn't about voting for Jesse White. It's about voting for an appointment for Jesse White. And we can only speculate who that would be. And if you take a look at some of the endorsements that Jesse White has had, he's previously endorsed Joe Barrios, Dorothy Brown, Derek Smith. He endorsed J.B. Pritzker even after he said he was the least offensive candidate, that he was an offensive candidate. This guy will endorse anybody that Madigan tells him to endorse. Joe Barrios is the most corrupt tax assessor in the history of the United States that by over-assessing commercial properties made Madigan millions of dollars. And as a result, that tax burden fell on the working middle class and poverty-stricken neighborhoods in Cook County, and as well as documented in a Chicago Tribune series. So my problem is that there'd be an appointment, and obviously the governor would make the appointment. I made the statement at Governor's Day that this is an appointment election if Jesse White wins. And somebody said, well, Governor Rauner, if he's governor, he makes the appointment. And I said to the person, do you think he'd appoint a Republican to Jesse White's position? People would be rioting in the streets of Chicago if that happened. I don't see that happening. So Jesse, he just wants to be done. Okay. I don't want to work till I'm 84.
So
I'll tell you that right now.
If Rauner's elected, that he wouldn't appoint a Republican?
I think he'd have to appoint a Democrat.
No, what happened was, so I made the statement at the state fair, and what had happened was, I didn't do my research on this, but I was told this. When you're at the county level, obviously as state's attorney, we've had some county board vacancies and things of that nature, and our sheriff died in office within the first 2 weeks that I was there. But what had happened was you have to fill it with the party that had the position. And apparently I was informed by the staffers, I didn't know this until after they informed me, is that they actually can appoint anybody. They can appoint anybody to that position, Republican or Democrat. Ultimately, I think the fair and just thing that if Jesse White stepped down, that it's a Democrat seat, that it's filled with a Democrat. I mean, it's fair and just. I mean, the voters have spoken. I mean, like you talked about platforms on the first couple of questions. I mean, if the voters say they want a Democrat in there, regardless of who it is, the voters have spoken. I think it'd be a real tough situation for me if he resigned and we had Governor Rauner and he said, hey, Jason, go fill that position. I think ultimately it'd be the fair and just thing to fill it with the Democrat. But I'm telling you, it's a term limits election, and 80% of people believe that term limits should be there for the constitutional office holders.
Okay. Well, we are out of time for today. We thank you for meeting with us, and we invite you to give a brief closing statement, kind of your elevator pitch about why you should be the next Secretary of State for the state of Illinois. I
think I've given a few elevator pitches over the last year, but it's just a summary of what we've already stated. I mean, this is a term limits election. It's time for a change. I mean, I'm ready, willing, and able to serve as your next Secretary of State for the next 4 years, and I appreciate your time today. Thanks for having me out.